Hello, my name is Usacheva. I'm a core fellow at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies, and today I'm here with you to speak about Christian Ensoulment theories within dualist psychological discourse. Throughout millennia, questions about the beginning and the end of human life have excited a similar kind of curiosity, worry, or awe. Long before the dawn of Christianity, Hellenic thought about the mystery of life generally revolved around various interpretations of the union between the perceptible and perishable nature of our body with the non-perishable intelligible nature of the soul. Although these principles are traditionally associated with Platonic substance dualism, it is nonetheless well known that Aristotle and Stoics of all generations also recognized the fundamental difference between perceptible and perishable and intelligible and non-perishable natures. However, the numerous disagreements between the philosophical schools were so substantial that they almost overshadowed their consensus on the mere existence of intelligible and corporeal natures. In its turn, the Christian doctrine of bodily resurrection simultaneously emphasized and challenged all the different types of substance dualism known to Greek philosophy. Thus, on the one hand, right from the start of Christian preaching, God was established as spiritual, non-perishable, independent, and eternal, while man was a dependent creature that combined in her nature corporeal and perishable with the spiritual and everlasting. And you may consider a passage in Genesis 2:7. This essential distinction between God and man was counterbalanced by a belief in the creation of man in the image of God and in ongoing divine assistance in human reproduction. In such a way, God himself guaranteed the presence of his divine image in man and thereby procured a way to human bodily resurrection and salvation. The dogmas of Christ's incarnation and of bodily resurrection, which implied the everlasting existence of corporeal nature, married two fundamental metaphysical principles of Greek philosophy which were very often viewed as incompatible, namely the existence of perishable corporeal nature and non-perishable intelligible nature. Thus, Christian belief in the twofold holistic character of human nature was supported by a conviction in union between divine and human natures in Christ and also his bodily resurrection. In this way, a special form of substance dualism coupled with an attempt to overcome it are inherent in Christian thought. If one or another is taken away, the whole system collapses. Right from the start, Christian preaching had a pronounced apocalyptic character with the emphasis on bodily resurrection after death in the closely expected kingdom of God. Thus, in 1 Corinthians 6:13, Paul famously argued against those who did not believe in the resurrection of the body and considered bodily life irrelevant for the task of salvation. Moreover, in Paul's terms, the whole procedure of individual salvation was represented as a transformation of physical body into spiritual body. In other words, Paul's preaching was not so much about the salvation of the soul, but rather about bodily transformation understood in the words of Vito Limoni, and I quote, as the personal, individual unity of physical and non-physical dimensions, end of quote. Irenaeus of Lyon, in his Adversus Haeresis, aptly grasped this Pauline attitude to the body when he described the process of resurrection as the transformation of the ignoble and dead flesh into the glorious and incorruptible body, consider Adversus Hieresis 572. Thus, we can see that the influence of both dualist and holistic principles pertains throughout Christian anthropology, from the Ensoulment theories and all the way to the eschatological doctrine. Today, I shall particularly focus on the patristic views on reproduction within the framework of Hellenic embryology. I'm going to demonstrate that although on the surface of Christian views on Ensoulment we see various philosophical influences, yet the rationale of Christian ideas remained different from the metaphysical principles of the philosophical schools and true to the metaphysical principles of Christian doctrine. Now, the first topic we are going to focus upon today is the early Christian Ensoulment theories and Aristotelian embryology. In his profound analysis of early Christian embryological theories, Bernard Poudron affirmed the strong influence of Aristotle on the procreation doctrine of the early Church Fathers. In Poudron's exposition, the Stagirides embryology regarded the process of conception as a result of the emission of the form-bearing male seed toeidos into the female and the subsequent mixture of the seed with the female menses, which provide matter for the embryo, eule. In this picture, the male seed acts as the formal and efficient cause of the embryo, while the female menses provide the material cause by nourishing and sheltering the embryo. In my opinion, Poudron has slightly overestimated Aristotelian influence on the early Christian procreation doctrine. Aristotle was a strong proponent of the one-seed theory, and indeed, most of the early Church Fathers endorsed the same position. However, Aristotle formulated an internal theory of embryology, that is to say, he believed that the male seed alone is the transmitter of the soul. In his De Generatione Animalium, Aristotle said, I quote, "Hence it is clear that the semen possesses soul and that it is soul potentially." End of quote. In other words, the potential ensouling capacity of the seed proceeds to action, in other words, becomes actualized whenever it is presented with the matter to be acted upon, that is to say, with the female menses in the womb. This picture describes the essentially natural process of internal self-reproduction, which includes two contributors, the mother and the father. Unlike Aristotle, the early Christian authors disapproved of the internal view of Ensoulment because it was incompatible with their opinion about the role of God in the process of conception. Thus, at the beginning of his De Resurrectione, Athenagoras explicitly said that the male seed gives origin to the body, while the power of God enables the shapeless matter to become a lived human being. The essential role of God in the process of Ensoulment was particularly important for Athenagoras' argument because he took this point further and claimed that as at the moment of birth, similarly in the eschaton, God will reassemble the dissolved elements, reunite the bodies with their souls, and bring them back to life. Now I quote from Athenagoras' De Resurrectione 3:2. And it is no damage to the argument if some suppose the first beginnings to be from matter, or the bodies of man at least to be derived from the elements as the first materials, or from sin. For that power which could give shape to what is regarded by them as shapeless matter, and adorn it when destitute of form and order, with many and diverse forms, and gather into one the several portions of the elements, and divide the seed which was one and simple into many, and organize that which was unorganized, and give life to that which had no life, that same power can reunite what is dissolved and raise up what is prostrate and restore the dead to life again and put the corruptible into the state of incorruption. End of quote. A similar line of eschatological argumentation was also adopted by Justin the Martyr, who, in his first Apology 19, referred to the miracle of conception as a promise of future resurrection. Pseudo-Justin, in his De Resurrectione, explicitly called the soul a part of God and his inspiration. Methodius of Olympus spoke of, I quote, the creative power of God, which under the cover of generation, making use of our nature, invisibly forms us men within, working the garments of the souls. End of quote. Even Tertullian, who, unlike the majority of Christian authors, insisted upon the corporeal nature of the soul, believed that the intelligible part of the soul comes from God. It is not unlikely that Christian authors inherited the concept of the divine partaking in the process of conception from the Old Testament tradition, filled with the accounts of divine intervention or providence about the procreation of Israel. You may consider passages from the stories of Sarah in Genesis 17:16, Rebecca in Genesis 25:21, and Rachel in Genesis 29. The difference between the early Christian and Aristotelian views of embryology can be traced back to the different conceptions of the soul held by these authors. The Stagirite, in his famous first chapter of the second book of the Anima, famously defined the soul as, I quote, the first actuality of an organic body having life in potentiality, end of quote. As actuality or entelechia, or simply energy, of the body, the soul cannot be alive without the body. This is why, according to Aristotle, the process of ensoulment is gradual, and that, I quote, those principles whose activity is physical cannot be present without a physical body. There can, for example, be no walking without feet, end of quote. Hence, Aristotle argued that at first the embryo lives the life of a plant run by the nutritive soul. Then the life of an animal run by the sensitive soul, and eventually the rational soul actualizes itself in a properly and fully formed man. This theory explains why Aristotle considered abortion a totally decent measure until the 40th day of pregnancy. That is, as he argued about it in his Politics, before the embryo has developed sensation and life, so before it became an animal. Unlike Aristotle, the early Christian authors differentiated between the principles of physical formation provided by the male seed and the soul provided by God. Thus, as I have demonstrated, Athenagoras, Justin, Tertullian, and Methodius affirmed that the bodily principles are contained in the male seed, while God ensouls the embryo at the moment of conception. A conviction that ensoulment is simultaneous to conception meant that every abortion looked like a murder in the eyes of early Christian authors. And in this respect, their opinion was different not only from the Peripathetics, but also from Platonists, Stoics, Galen, and indeed all the medical doctors. Although the early Christian authors uniformly supported the one-seed doctrine, I think that this fact does not prove a strong Aristotelian influence on their doctrines of procreation. Because unlike Aristotle, Christians believed in the external theory of ensoulment, which in many respects was essential for the metaphysical principles of their theology. Thus, external ensoulment agreed with the concept of God the Creator, whose providential care had not ceased after the Hexameron. Now, in the second part of my today's lecture, I'm going to talk about Platonic embryology and compare it to the Christian views on procreation. Generally speaking, there are not so many similarities between Platonic and Christian views on procreation. I counted only two: the mutual support of the one-seed concept and of external ensoulment. For example, Gregory of Nyssa, in his proof of the external theory of ensoulment, said that, I quote, "Nothing among the things in nature is brought into existence without deriving its peculiar constitution from evil as its source." End of quote. Similar argumentation was often applied by Neoplatonists, for it proceeded from the conviction that the product is always an interior likeness of its producer. James Wilberding recognized this idea as one of the three main principles of Neoplatonic metaphysics. In tune with this principle, Porphyry maintained that the seed, which upholds the principles of physical formation, is generated by, as he put it, something worse than itself, and he meant the vegetative soul of the father. So, according to Porphyry, it would take an intervention of the sensitive soul of the mother in order to set the form principles contained in the embryos, contained in the male seed, in motion. As I have shown earlier, Christians also saw in the seed a provider of the form principles of the physical body, and thus distinguished the contribution of the seed from the life-giving ensoulment provided by God. Like the Neoplatonists, Gregory of Nyssa professed that the seed is generated by the vegetative soul of the father. Similarly to most philosophers and medical doctors of his day, Gregory of Nyssa believed in the tripartite version of the soul, tripartite vision of the soul, comprised of vegetative, sensitive, and rational parts. While Aristotle argued that the seed contains in itself the form principles of the vegetative and sensitive parts of the soul, Neoplatonists credited the male seed with the transmission of the vegetative soul only. In the Neoplatonic view, sensitive and rational souls do not enter the foetus or child before its birth, because this would contradict the hitherto described second metaphysical principle of their doctrine. The distinctly hierarchical structure of Neoplatonic psychology rendered it impossible for them to accept that the vegetative soul of the father could generate anything higher than the vegetative soul contained in the seed. Therefore, sensitive and rational souls come later. Unlike the hylomorphic psychology of Aristotle or the naturalistic psychology of Galen, Neoplatonists considered the whole process of embodiment of the rational soul as its degradation. In Neoplatonic eyes, the embodied status of the soul was as unnatural as it was pitiable. Christian authors stoutly opposed such views. According to the metaphysical principle of Christian religion, the paradoxical kind of union between mortal body and immortal intelligible soul was designed by God, and therefore, obviously, it was good. Moreover, this union of the soul and body was secured in the eyes of Christians and also sanctified by the incarnation of Christ and also by the expectation of the upcoming bodily resurrection. The early Christian allegiance to holistic anthropology continued also into the 4th century. Thus, similarly to Athenagoras, who gave a rather lengthy account of the soul-body interdependence, Gregory of Nyssa also argued, and I'm quoting from his De Apificio Hominis 3029, for our purpose was to show that the seminal cause of our constitution is neither a soul without body nor a body without soul, but that from animated and living bodies it is generated at the first as a living and animate being, and that our humanity takes it and cherishes it like a nursling with the resources she herself possesses, and it thus grows on both sides and makes its growth manifest correspondently in either part. For it at once displays by this artificial and scientific process of formation the power of soul that is interwoven in it, appearing at first somewhat obscurely, but afterwards increasing in radiance concurrently with the perfection of the work. End of quote. Now it becomes clear from this passage that Gregory renounced the critical Neoplatonic attitude to the embodied status of the soul and declared the soul-body liaison a mutually befitting and indeed glorious union. Although Gregory acknowledged the incremental development of both bodily and psychic powers of the embryo, yet his more detailed vision of this development was different from the positions of Aristotle and Porphyry. Aristotle and also Galen stood for epigenesis. So epigenesis consists in the idea that psychic powers of the embryo develop gradually, following up the formation of bodily organs. Porphyry believed that the formation of the bodily organs is not accomplished until the fetus leaves the womb. Hence, sensitive and rational parts of the soul enter it only at birth. Gregory maintained that the moment of conception comprises two simultaneous processes. First, formation of the embryo out of the male seed and female menses, and second, the ensoulment, somehow provided and empowered by God. As a result of conception, the embryo receives the full package of the necessary bodily and psychic functions in the state of potentiality. In other words, according to Gregory, the vegetative, sensitive, and rational parts or powers of the soul are potentially present in the embryo right from the moment of conception. A similar vision of the incremental development of the embryo, combined with the idea of comprehensive ensoulment at the moment of conception, was also shared by Basil of Caesarea. Now, another important aspect of the Aristotelian, Neoplatonic, and Christian versions of the one-seed theory was their explanation of the hereditary traits of the parents. Aristotle defined the male seed generated from the fully concocted blood as the transmitter of kinesis, and he thought that this transmitter of kinesis is able to set the menses, which he understood as non-concocted blood, in motion, and thereby it is able to conceive the embryo. So the fully concocted blood sets in motion the non-concocted blood, and thereby conception happens. As Roberto Lopresti has persuasively demonstrated, the roles of male and female and in Aristotle's perception of the process of conception should not be understood as dominion versus submission, but rather as a collaboration or as a matching and effectual partnership. In such a way, Aristotle remarked that while the active power of the male seed acts upon the passive power of the female menses, the latter can act back. Besides, the matter provided by the female can not only submit to the power of the seed, but also resist it. Therefore, the result of this collaboration between the active male and passive female powers can rightfully account for the hereditary traits of both parents, because we can see that it is a real collaboration. and not just a submission one to another. Neoplatonists had a different vision of the process of conception. In Porphyry's view, the seed generated by the vegetative soul of the father lacks actual motion and receives this motion from the sensitive soul of the mother. And in this way, as James Wilberding has convincingly demonstrated, Neoplatonists explain the hereditary traits of both parents by the way of pointing at the creative collaboration between the vegetative soul of the father and the vegetative and sensitive souls of the mother. As for the early Christian vision of hereditary traits transmission, the ambiguous evidence we have about it makes our conjectures rather loose. On the one hand, we have statements that seem to testify that maternal contribution to the embryo and fetus does not extend to the transmission of hereditary traits. For example, Methodius of Olympus declared that when a man, and I quote, is overcome by the desire of generation, he offers his side to the divine creator so that the father may again appear in the son. Note that only the father, not the mother. On the other hand, Gregory of Nyssa professed that a child, and I quote, is the very image of its parents' beauty, end of quote. Parents meaning both. These and other similar statements about hereditary traits transmission may be easily considered equivocal and interpreted in various ways. What can be said with certainty is that in the case of the birth of Christ, theologians demonstrated a more pronounced concern about the maternal contribution to the embryo and fetus than in the case of regular human reproduction. Thus, at the background of the dogma of Mary's virginity was a belief that the human nature of Christ was without sin because he inherited it from his uncorrupted mother. At the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century, Theodore of Mopsuestia thus framed the issue of Mary's maternal contribution to the formation of Christ's nature. And now I quote, "It was a noble thing to have been fashioned from a woman without marital intercourse, by the power of the Holy Spirit. But he is associated with the human nature by the fact that he is from the nature of Mary. And it is from that he is said also to be the seed of David and Abraham, and in his nature he is related to them." End of quote. Christological discussions of the 5th century introduced a new twist to Christian embryological discourse, and I shall focus upon it in the next lecture, which will be devoted to the embryological theories, Christian embryological theories of the 5th century. And now, coming to the conclusions, to summarize the main observations that I made in my talk, I made the table number 1, which you can now see on your screens. And while we could talk a lot about it, but since we don't have enough time, I will just sum it up very, very quickly. As you can see, by a rough and rather superficial count, we can observe that in the matters of embryology and ensoulment, Christians had 4 points in common with Aristotle, and 2 with Galen, and 2 with the Neoplatonists. This perfunctory statistic, in my opinion, does not testify to any superior influence of Aristotle on Christian teaching. Because Christian embryology was framed by the metaphysical principles of their own doctrine, and although it showed a remarkable creativity at combining various aspects of various philosophical teachings without fully accepting any one of them. This attitude demonstrates that in answering embryological questions, Christian authors merely consulted philosophical and medical opinions of their time, while principally theologians were guided by the logic of their own religious discourse. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you liked it. Goodbye. Stay safe.